I'm Mike McDermott, and this is the final video reviewing the Indian Wars that the United States Army participated in. The last two were fought initially by the Ute Indians and then secondly by the Sioux Indians. But first, the Utes. They were a powerful and warlike tribe who traditionally roamed western Colorado and the Rocky Mountains into Utah and south into New Mexico. While they tended herds of cattle and sheep, they also hunted buffalo east of the mountains and regularly fought the Plains Indians as well as the Navajo to the south. In 1868, the Utes, accepting the counsel of their longtime friend and one-time agent, Kit Carson, agreed to accept a large reservation in western Colorado and northeastern Utah. Two bands were affiliated with an agency at White River in the northern part of the reservation, and other bands registered at agencies farther south and in Utah. Gold and silver strikes in the 1870s brought a surge of miners onto reservation land, and when Colorado gained statehood in 1876, a congressional effort to have the Utes removed to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma was initiated. Although removal attempts failed, emotions were raw and a series of incidents and accusations kept tensions very high on the Ute reservation. The violent uprising, which finally occurred in 1879, resulted from an issue that developed between the Utes at White River and the resident agent who demanded that the Indians become farmers and gain agricultural self-sufficiency. And he was pushing the issue and not willing to wait. Agent Nathan Meeker was single-minded and uncompromising in his demands and was confronted several times by Indians who resisted abandoning their traditional customs to immediately start farming. To support his ambitious plans, the agent insisted on plowing up meadows where Ute horse herds normally grazed, a development that brought the White River Indians to the brink of revolt. Recognizing the increasing possibility of violence, Agent Meeker called for military assistance to enforce his program, and in response, an expedition commanded by Major Thomas Thoroughborough, numbering 153 soldiers, 25 civilians, and 33 supply wagons, marched out of Fort Steele, Wyoming on 21 September 1879. 5 days later, and about 60 miles from the White River Agency, a delegation of Ute leaders met Major Thoroughborough and asked him to stop his expedition and go with them to the agency for talks. The major agreed, but decided to first move the troops closer to the agency, and the cavalry crossed Milk Creek, the northern boundary of the reservation, about 15 miles from White River. And there they encountered about 100 Ute warriors blocking their advance. The cavalry deployed, shots were fired, and the battle was on. One of the Ute chiefs later stated the Indians wanted to talk, but he recounted, quote, "I was with General Crook the year before fighting the Sioux, and I knew in a minute that as soon as this officer deployed his men out in that way, it meant a fight. So I told my men to deploy as well." Major Thoroughborough was killed in the exchange of fire, and the cavalry pulled back across the creek to join the wagons, who were then circling into a corral. The troopers, now commanded by Captain Scott Payne, were soon under constant and accurate rifle fire, which continued as the day wore on. So the troops took refuge inside the circled wagons to stand off the attack. The defenders were particularly hard-pressed when the Indians set fire to the prairie in an effort to burn them out. By nightfall, 10 soldiers were dead, and another 23 men were wounded, while most of the horses and the mules inside the corral had also been hit, and many of them killed. On the same afternoon, warriors attacked and killed Agent Meeker and 10 other men employed at the agency. The Indians also took 3 women and 2 children hostage, to include the agent's wife and daughter, who had recently graduated from college and was a teacher on the reservation. That night, Captain Payne had 4 men ride for Rawlins, Wyoming, to spread the news of the ongoing fight at Milk Creek. Union Pacific trains delivered Colonel Wesley Merritt with his command of 4 cavalry troops and 5 infantry companies to Rawlins, where they immediately began a 160-mile march that was accomplished in 2 days. At the same time, Captain Francis Dodge, who had been investigating claims accusing Utes of setting forest fires, appeared at Milk Creek with a cavalry troop to bolster those defenders. The fight continued when Colonel Merritt's forces arrived from Rawlins, Wyoming, and the Indians faded away after a short scrimmage. Conditions at the wagon corral were intolerable. About 300 dead animals in and around the position, so the soldiers moved about a mile to clean ground. Army casualties totaled 13 men killed and 48 wounded. The Utes later acknowledged that 23 warriors had also died during the fight. Captains Payne and Dodge were detailed to escort the wounded to Rawlins, and Colonel Merritt marched to the White River Agency. On the 11th of October, he found all the buildings had been burned, and the dead agent and his employees were still laying on the ground where they'd been killed. News of the abduction of the women and children caused a national uproar, and troops poured into the region. Colonel Merritt started after the White River Utes with a reinforced command of about 1,600 men, but was stopped by the Secretary of the Interior, who ordered that military operations cease until negotiations could secure the release of the white captives. While Colonel Merritt was upset at being, quote, equipped for a campaign by one arm of the government and halted in its execution by another arm of the same government, on the verge of winter in a country where all campaigning very shortly would be forced to stop. General Philip Sheridan was more outspoken in his response to the Secretary's order. And Sheridan wrote, "We went to the agency at the solicitation of the Indian Bureau, whose agent had been murdered and our men killed and wounded, and now we are left in the heart of the mountains with our hands tied and the danger of being snowed in staring us in the face. I am not easily discouraged," wrote General Sheridan, "but it looks as though we have been pretty badly sold out in this business." On 21 October, the white captives were released, but only after other Ute bands threatened to attack the White River Indians, and the negotiators promised to stop Colonel Merritt's advance. After a series of meetings lasting into December, a joint commission of Ute chiefs, Interior Department officials, and Army officers decided the Indians had not initially intended to fight Major Thorborough, and so none should be held culpable for that action. 12 Indians, however, were arrested and tried for the murder of Agent Meeker and his employees, and the kidnapping and the abuse of the women. Those individuals were convicted and sent to the federal penitentiary at Fort Leavenworth. Congress then passed a bill requiring the Utes to make certain payments from their government annuities to the captives and the families of those who had been murdered. In fact, that legislation called for paying the 5 women who were involved $500 annually for a period of 20 years. And some of the employees, next of kin, were to also be paid $200 a year for a period of 20 years. And thus ended the fight with the Ute tribe in Colorado. In 1883, on the eve of his retirement as commanding general of the Army, General Tecumseh Sherman wrote, "I now regard the Indians as substantially eliminated from the problem of the Army. There may be spasmodic and temporary alarms, but such Indian wars as have hitherto disturbed the public peace and tranquility are not probable." End quote. By then, all the tribes had been forced onto reservations, and General Sherman's assessment was essentially correct, although all of the consequences of that process had not yet been fully realized. Anger, bitterness, frustration, and above all, a pervasive sense of helplessness and futility described the shock of the Indians' defeat and subjugation. The traditional social, economic, political, military, and religious customs and practices of Indian society were being corrupted or rendered absolutely meaningless, and no satisfactory new ways had been provided by the strictures of reservation life. Government policy emphasized remaking Indians into self-sufficient landowning farmers, while reservation officials, school teachers, missionaries, and other agents for change worked to force the issue. Attempts to install agricultural self-sufficiency repeatedly encountered the realities of Western soil and climate, while the spoils system continued to produce incompetent or corrupt Indian agents who punished those who they described as non-progressive by withholding their rations and other supplies. The 1887 Dawes Act added to the toxic mix by opening reservation land to settlement when it was deemed excess to Indian needs. Indians saw that program as another government land grab, a perception that seemed to be confirmed when most of the Great Sioux Reservation became available to homesteaders. Recalling the Great Sioux Reservation was basically the western half of the state of South Dakota plus some other land. It left one Indian to comment, and he said, "They made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it." In the late 1880s, a Paiute shaman in Nevada named Wovoka offered an escape from the harsh realities of reservation life. He preached a peaceful doctrine, blending elements of Christianity with native beliefs, and his ghost dance religion gained an increasing number of adherents, to include many Sioux who were struggling to survive on their truncated reservations in Dakota. Wovoka preached a new world where Indians would be reunited with their dead friends and relatives in a life free of pain, sickness, and want, in a place also devoid of white people. By praying, singing, and dancing the prescribed ghost dance, and embracing a rigid moral code strongly suggestive of the Ten Commandments, adherents could glimpse a blissful future. Wovoka preached his heavenly vision could be attained only if life was free of fighting and no harm was done to others. The primary Sioux ghost dance adherents, men named Short Bull and Kicking Bear, added a militaristic element to Wovoka's teaching by persuading Sioux warriors to wear ghost shirts that had been blessed and that would turn the white man's bullets. Some felt the millennium could be facilitated by confronting the source of their bitterness, a prospect which caused increasing concern among government employees and settlers in nearby communities. While Eastern progressives insisted the growth of settlement made Indian warfare impossible, General Nelson Miles, commanding the Division of the Missouri, pointed out that many Indians, and particularly the Sioux, possessed repeating rifles and ammunition in abundance, and if they decided to go to war with their antagonists, they could. By November 1890, the ghost dancers on Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations in the southwestern portion of South Dakota had worked themselves into a state of excitement and disorder bordering on anarchy. The Pine Ridge agent requested military assistance, and on the 13th of November, President Benjamin Harrison directed the Army to take action. A week later, 600 soldiers occupied the two agencies, while additional units boarded trains for Sioux country. The Indians on those two reservations divided into groups. Some people wanted no part of a conflict with the troops, while others chose to withdraw to remote areas on the reservation so they could continue to dance. About 600 warriors and their families, under the leadership of their ghost dance shaman and labeled hostiles by the government, occupied a secluded plateau and pursued their ghost dance vision. Ghost dancing had also taken hold on other reservations, and the agents farther north on the Cheyenne River Reservation ordered the Indian police to arrest Sitting Bull, who was actively encouraging the new religion. That agent ordered the Indian police to arrest Sitting Bull, which led to a confrontation in his front yard. And not only was Sitting Bull, but a number of his relatives and supporters shot down. In the process, they killed a like number of Indian police. The violent death of the old chief caused some of his followers to join his half-brother, Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, and his band of 350 Sioux, who were among the most enthusiastic of the ghost dancers. With Sitting Bull's death, they decided to travel south to the Pine Ridge Reservation. From his headquarters in Rapid City, General Miles ordered the Bigfoot band stopped, and a detachment of cavalry intercepted them coming out of the Badlands on the 28th of December. And it's interesting to note that this was a detachment of the 7th Cavalry, previously commanded by General Custer, who had run into some of these same Indians on the Little Bighorn some years before. The Indians camped along Wounded Knee Creek, some 20 miles east of the Pine Ridge Agency, and during the evening, Colonel James Forsyth arrived with a battery of 4 Hotchkiss guns. These are small cannon on wheels, and the rest of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. The troops took up positions around the 350 Indians in their camp, and approximately 500 soldiers were present the following day when an attempt to disarm the Indians caused a fight, which quickly spiraled into a disaster. Accounts vary concerning how the shooting started, as well as the number of casualties. But when the day ended, more than 150 Indians, including women and children, were dead, and approximately 50 more were wounded, while the Army reported a total of 64 casualties, soldiers killed and wounded. All the wounded were loaded into wagons and taken to the agency, and on New Year's Day, 1891, the Indian dead, which included Chief Bigfoot, were buried in a mass grave on a low hill overlooking the site of the devastated village. The ghost dancers with Short Bull and Kicking Bear were returning from their ceremonies when they learned of the trouble at Wounded Knee. They joined other Indians who were fleeing, and the next day, a brief confrontation with troopers took place at the Drexel Indian Mission, which is 4 miles north of the agency headquarters. Following an exchange of fire between the Indians and the Army, A more serious incident was averted when the soldiers pulled back and about 4,000 potentially combative Indians established a big camp. General Miles then ringed that camp with approximately 5,500 soldiers, and over a period of 2 weeks of negotiations, he succeeded in convincing the Sioux to turn in their weapons and to return to the agency. Kicking Bear surrendered his rifle to General Miles on the 15th of January, 1891, ending the ghost dance phenomena and the Army's last major Indian confrontation following 100 years of Indian wars conducted by the United States Army. The ghost dance craze reflected a desperate wish for the lost life of unfettered freedom, and General Miles called Wounded Knee an outrageous blunder. He relieved Colonel Forsyth, labeling him incompetent and irresponsible, and charging him with disobeying orders. Forsyth demanded a court of inquiry, which disagreed with General Miles and returned Colonel Forsyth to his command. Nevertheless, the tragedy continues to trouble the American conscience, primarily because many of the Indian dead were women and children, but also because the violence should have been avoided. Bigfoot's band was en route to the agency, and subsequent events demonstrated how a show of force, coupled with negotiations, could have achieved a peaceful outcome. Wovoka, a one-time ranch hand, also known as Jack Wilson, he worked on a ranch owned by a man named Wilson, and he took the name Jack Wilson, was shocked by the events in South Dakota and was quoted as saying, "My children, today I call upon you to follow a new trail, the only trail now open, the white man's road." I was born and raised in South Dakota, and I have visited the site of Wounded Knee a number of times. There is a monument near the site where the village was established along Wounded Knee Creek, which is just a very, very small prairie creek, which only has much water in it if there's been local rains. And on that low hill is the burial place for all of the Indians who were killed that particular day. There used to be a small Catholic church located very close to the burial site. That small white painted Catholic church stood on that hill for many, many years adjacent to the burial site. And at the foot of the hill was a trading post, a small general store owned by an Indian family. And both of those buildings were burned down in 1973 in that standoff between adherents of the American Indian Movement, AIM, and the federal government, primarily in the person of FBI agents. At any rate, a number of the American Indian Movement leaders were subsequently arrested, and not only because of the standoff at Wounded Knee, but also in other unrelated actions. In one case, 2 FBI agents were shot to death while sitting in their car on the reservation. And the upshot of it is that American Indian Movement leaders were charged and tried in a federal court in St. Paul. A number of trials were conducted, and a number of those Indians went to jail. Wounded Knee on the reservation in South Dakota remains a touchy subject. It's a raw wound which has not totally healed, although it was an action that took place a long time ago. But the direct descendants of the people who were killed and others who were injured during those fights with the Army continue to remember their family history. And should you ever have the opportunity to visit the reservations in southwestern South Dakota, I would recommend that you visit the Wounded Knee site and walk up that hill and visit the burial place of the men and women and the children who were killed during that freezing December in 1890. And so ends the campaigns against the Indians conducted by the United States Army over a period of 100 years, from 1790, when Washington was in the White House, until 1890, which for many in that part of the country was only yesterday. Thank you for watching. Please make any comments that you would like to make, and God bless the United States of America.